Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all doing well at home. It's nice and sunny in North Dakota, about 60 degrees, but it's going to get cold again, so I'm going to enjoy it while we have the nice weather. But today we're going to be talking about Chapter 12, Behavioral Therapy. And really, when we're talking about behavioral therapy, we're going to be talking about conditioning. So we're going to be talking about classical conditioning and its place when we're talking about therapy, and we're going to be talking about operant conditioning and its place when we're talking about behavioral type of therapy. So let's get started. So when we're talking about classical conditioning, we're often talking about Pavlov and his dogs. I hope you all know that experience or experiment by this point in time. If you don't, let me know and we can go through that a little further. And then we also talk about Thorndike and Skinner when we're talking about operant types of conditioning. So when we're talking about Thorndike's law of effects, all organisms pay attention to the consequences or effects of their actions. So if they get a positive outcome, they're going to be more likely to do that action again. If there's going to be a negative consequence, we are going to be less likely to engage in those actions as we go on. So there are going to be some different goals when we're talking about our main goals of behavior therapy. Well, one of the main things that we need to make sure is that our theory should be stated in a testable hypothesis. We like to collect empirical data, and TRUOX, which is scientific nature of behavioral therapy. And this is the endeavor of developing and testing hypothesis in real clinician settings, much like that of a scientist. So actually taking that empirical research, coming up with our own hypothesis, developing and testing it actually out in the field in a real clinical setting versus any other setting. So similar to what a scientist would do when they're talking about their work. So when we're talking about the 5 steps in a scientific method, first off, we're going to observe the phenomenon. So we're going to look at the client's behavior. We might observe them out in their natural setting. At that point in time, we often will define a target behavior and we'll establish a baseline for that behavior. So as a school counselor, one thing we often did is a FBA, which was a functional behavioral analysis. So what we would look at is what is the problem behavior that we're looking at? What is our definition of that behavior, and what is the baseline? How often are they doing that behavior? What is the behavior that we want to change? How infrequently do we want them to, how less often do we want them to do that behavior, and so forth. So next, you'd have to develop a hypothesis to explain that phenomenon. And here's where the functional behavior analysis comes in. So functionally analyzing that target behavior to determine the factors that are causing or influencing it. So what is that person getting out of engaging in that behavior? Are they getting attention? Are they getting some other type of gratification? Why are they engaging in that type of behavior? Once we know what they're getting from that behavior, it's easier for us to establish specific behavioral goals for treatment. So if they are getting, if they're engaging in those behaviors for attention, how can we give them attention in other settings so that it might prevent that onset of that behavior? Next, we test the hypothesis. So we implement the intervention as planned. So if the behavior is the student keeps blurting out in class in order to get attention from the teacher, we would then maybe start calling on the student first before any other students and seeing if that prevents that outburst because this teacher did not call on them. Then we'd go back and observe the outcome of the test. So we'd collect data over time. How many outbursts did that student have in class that week after we started implementing that behavior? How often did they have that behavior within a month time? We would then compare the data during the treatment versus that baseline data, and we would compare it to the goals. Are we meeting the goals where we want to, or do we need to adjust our behavior? Last is we would revise the hypothesis. So are we meeting our goals? If not, if that doesn't seem to be the reason the person's engaging that behavior, we might need to take it back to the table and say, okay, we're giving this a person a lot of extra attention and they're still blurting out. Is there another reason why they might be blurting out instead of getting attention from the teacher? So always going back and revising that hypothesis if the first one doesn't seem to be working out. So this just goes further through. So defining that behavior, focusing on measurable behaviors. We need to be able to measure that behavior to determine whether or not we are meeting our goals or changing that behavior over time. So kind of talked about that. So classical conditioning. So as I already said, classical conditioning is often going to focus on Pavlov and his dogs. It's going to be related to those unconditioned stimuluses. So one of the things that occurs when we go through classical conditioning is going to be generalization. And this occurs when the conditioned response is evoked by stimulus that are similar to, but not an exact match for the conditioned stimulus. But we also have discrimination. And discrimination occurs when the conditioned response is not evoked by such a stimulus. I apologize if you can hear my 3-year-old screaming. She is out there with her grandma and I am not sure what just took place. She's a busy little body, so I can only imagine what happened out there. So after classical conditioning, we then move into operant conditioning. And this occurs when the organism operates on the environment. So they notice the consequences of their behavior, so it can be a positive or negative consequence, and we incorporate those consequences when we make future decisions regarding our behavior. So for example, if it sounded like my 3-year-old was playing with a car of some sort, if she was playing with the car running really fast and she fell and hurt herself, next time around she'd be less likely to run fast holding the car because she would learn that she's more likely to trip when she's holding a heavy object while running. So operant conditioning, all of our behavior is the function of a consequence. Most of the behavior, almost all of the behavior we engage in is due to the fact that we either have a positive or a negative type of consequence. So for example, if you have a job and you go to work, why do you go to work? What is your reason for going to your job each day? Well, there might be a couple of different reasons. First off, you might get that fulfillment. You just feel joy going to work. You love your job. Or you might get a monetary paycheck from it. Those are all ways that encourage us to go to work on a daily basis. And when we're talking about operant conditioning, it's an active style of learning. So through trial and error, we find out what consequences are and what our positives in our lives are. So one of the ways that we use classical conditioning is often when we're using exposure therapy. So this is an example of facing your fears. So let's say that you're really afraid of spiders. We might use exposure therapy to prevent you to be less afraid of spiders. So in the way that a phobia becomes created is a particular stimulus becomes paired with an adverse outcome. So maybe over time, everybody just told you spiders were scary, or would say, oh, stay away from them, there's spiders. Eventually, over time, you'd be conditioned to be afraid of spiders. Or let's say you got bit by a spider. Or if you were like me, in 2nd or 3rd grade, they showed you the videos about like black widows or brown recluse spiders and said, if you get bit, you will die. And that then generalized your fear of spiders to all spiders because they're all icky and scary and can bite. And although you might not die, you just really don't want to be bit by them. So one thing we can do is imaginal exposure. Can be asked to imagine anxiety-provoking objects without ever being exposed to the real thing. So you would never actually have to come in contact with the spider. You could just simply imagine seeing a spider and working through that process instead of having to actually go near one. But there are other ways we can do this. We can do this in vivo exposure. Can be exposed to real life items or situations that have produced fear. And one way we can do this is through graded exposure. So the client and the therapist are going to work together to kind of come up with a hierarchy of what different steps they could take in order to become less afraid of spiders or whatever the phobia would be. So an example of these steps would be, let's say you're afraid of a dog. So one of the first steps you could do, which would cause you about a level of 5 on a 100-point fear scale, would be hearing a dog bark in another room. Then we could move to number 5, which is standing within 5 feet of a dog on a leash. That would give you about a fear level of about a 45, so right there in the middle. And then going all the way to petting a dog continuously for 3 minutes. That would give you a fear level of up to 95, so that would be the maximum fear level. So the point would be is that hoping we would start at number 1, having the person just hear the dog in another room, getting closer to a dog, petting a dog, and then petting a dog for a longer period of time, and hoping that through this period, the person would realize that they don't need to be afraid of dogs. Hopefully their heart rate could remain down, kind of controlling some of those automatic responses we have when we're scared. So deep breathing and so forth would help to hopefully eventually eliminate that fear or phobia that the person has when they're talking about dogs, or for me, spiders. And there's 2 different ways we can do this. First off, we can either use flooding or implosion, which is exposure that happens all at once rather than gradually. So just saying, here's a dog, pet it, and making them face all their fears at one single point in time. Another way that we can do this is through exposure and response prevention. So this involves graded exposure, so kind of like we talked about on that slide right before this, to the obsessive thoughts. So doing it gradually, little by little, instead of exposing the person to their fear all at once. Some other tools that we can use are systematic desensitization. So one way we would do that is through counter conditioning. So repairing feared objects with a new response that is incompatible with anxiety. So instead of pairing it with a person becoming stressed and anxious, we'd work on breathing techniques. We'd work on relaxation techniques so that our heart rate wouldn't get so high and we wouldn't have that shallow breathing. We can also do this through relaxation techniques. So teaching progressive relaxation techniques to that person. And moving that person through that anxiety hierarchy. So starting slow and building up over time to more stressful situations while keeping the client calm and relaxed as they move forward. Sometimes we can also focus on assertiveness training, and it's a specific application of classical conditioning that targets clients' social anxieties. It is best suited for people who are timid, apprehensive, or suffer with social behavior that has a negative impact on their lives. The exposure comes in the form of facing interpersonal fears, so fears of building those personal relationships with other people. There are some different steps that are involved, 4 main steps. So the first step is going to be direct instructions, which assertiveness training usually begins with the direct instructions from the behavior therapist, with which the client is taught specifically what to say and do in a particular situation. So kind of role playing ahead of time what the person is going to say and do when they get out there in a more informal type of settings. Next is going to be modeling of effective assertive behaviors. Next, effective assertive behaviors are modeled for the client. The behavioral therapist often does the modeling, but video recorded models or even live actors can also be used to show the person what appropriate behaviors look like. Then they'll practice a role-playing situation. So subsequently, the client is given an opportunity to rehearse the assertive behaviors in a role-playing situation, and the therapist actually provides specific constructive feedback. So when I say constructive, the therapist isn't going to say, wow, that was really crappy. They're going to say, here you were kind of weak, but you did this very nice. So keeping it more in a positive type of format instead of going the negative route. And last but not least, eventually clients are given targeted homework assignments in which they are expected to practice improving assertiveness skills in real life. So taking those skills they learned in the clinical type setting and transforming them into their day-to-day lives. So those are some techniques that are based in classical conditioning. Next, we're going to move into techniques based in operant conditioning. So reinforcement and punishment is essentially what we are talking about when we're talking about operant conditioning. So reinforcement makes a behavior more likely to reoccur in the future. And remember, there's positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. And then punishment makes a behavior less likely to reoccur in the future. So when I say positive and negative, I don't mean good and bad. I mean positive refers to adding a consequence or getting something good, where negative means removing a consequence or losing something bad. So an example of negative reinforcement would be is when you have a headache, you take Tylenol or ibuprofen, and it takes the headache away. So that would be an example of negative reinforcement. It takes away the bad thing, which makes you more likely to do it again. Aversion therapy is something that we often use when we're talking about operant conditioning in a clinical type of setting. So this is when an unwanted behavior brings about an adverse stimulus. This just talks more about extinction, so the removal of expected reinforcement that results in the decrease in frequency of behaviors. Token economies are often used with students in a school setting when we are working on clinical types of techniques or to prevent behaviors. But a clinician may also use token economies as well when working probably with younger kids or maybe even adolescents. And what this is when a client earns tokens for participating in predetermined target behaviors. They are versatile across clients, and it typically involves generalization. So when we talk about the definition of a token economy, is a setting in which clients earn tokens for participating in predetermined target behaviors. These tokens can then be exchanged for a number of reinforcements deemed desirable by the client. In some token economies, clients can also lose tokens for engaging in undesirable behaviors. So one thing I often saw in the school setting, especially with students that were on IEPs, they would get special tokens, which was actually just a sheet of paper that kept track of how they were doing throughout the day. And if they got all of their stars for the day or all of their check marks for the day, they were able to have 10 minutes of computer time at the end of the day. For them, that was a very incentivizing activity. And oftentimes that would motivate students to stay on task and do the behaviors that were expected of them. Or maybe if they got all of their check marks or stars for the week, they got a can of pop or a snack at the end of the week. That was another one that I often saw used. We also see it maybe in a psychiatric inpatient unit where different target behaviors may be identified for each client. One client may earn target tokens for making their bed, another for taking a shower, or another for interacting with the group instead of staying alone. And what we might see there is they might get extra TV time, extra game time if they earn enough tokens for these activities. This slide just talks a little bit about shaping. So involves reinforcing successive approximation of the target behavior. So kind of rewarding the person as they get closer to that targeted behavior. It should not make the steps between each new challenge too difficult for the client. So maybe taking baby steps to try and build up to that target behavior that you're looking for. But they should not be so small that the therapy takes a really long time. So trying to find that balance between not difficult enough and too difficult. So baby steps, but baby steps that are still going to challenge the patient, but not make it seem too difficult. Behavioral activation is one of the techniques that is based on operant conditioning. The goal is to increase frequency of behaviors that are positively reinforced to the client. As a result, clients experience more positive emotions and become more fully engaged in their life. Their tendencies to avoid unpleasant experiences diminish as the depression lifts. So really what it is it's just increasing behaviors that make the person feel good, that makes them feel happy instead of focusing on those negative aspects of the person's life. It can also be used well for anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders, personality disorders, schizophrenia, and chronic pain. Modeling is also very useful when we're talking about the clinical type of setting, especially if we're maybe looking at something like social skills. Being able to model that for a person can be very important in the development of them being able to learn new social skills. And there's two ways that we can do this. One way is through imitation. So the client simply mimics the modeled behavior, or through vicarious learning. The client observes not only the modeled behavior, but also the model receiving consequences for the modeled behavior. At BHS, we often would have social skills groups for our students that were on the autism spectrum. They didn't all have to be on the autism spectrum, but oftentimes the students in those groups would be. And there they would practice imitation, and sometimes they would even practice modeling. So the group leaders would teach them, would kind of show them how to interact in different settings, and then give them a chance to imitate that behavior and hopefully build some of those social skills that they may have been lacking in their everyday lives, and generalizing them in all settings, and hopefully not just in that group setting. The last section, which I'm pretty much just going to let you guys review, is going to be alternates to behavioral therapy. So we have behavioral consultation, and that just breaks it down a little further. Parent training. So oftentimes parents will seek help with problematic behaviors for their children. And not that it's the parents' fault, but sometimes parents are going to need retraining in how to respond to their children based on their behaviors. So they might need to define the problem behavior, and then use reinforcement and punishment effectively. So for example, let's say that my daughter's problem behavior is talking back, which she has been doing a lot lately these past 3 weeks. Week 1, we had a great time. Week 2 was a little rougher for isolation. This week, it's been a challenge, and it's only Monday at 4:42 p.m. So hopefully it gets better as the week goes on. But let's say we're looking at her talking back. So that would be the defined problem. So now a counselor may sit down and talk to me and say, well, how can we use reinforcements and punishments? So an example of a punishment we could use is that every time she talks back, she needs to be put in her room. And this could be a negative punishment because we are taking her away from the fun situation and making her go sit in her room by herself. And then we can also use a reinforcement. So if she does not talk back all day long, she can use her tablet at night for 20 minutes to watch Netflix. So that would be an example of how I could use reinforcement and punishment effectively. And that is something that we have instituted in our household to try and prevent some of this talking back, which is maybe coming from just that boredom. And for her, she's very anxious. Some of that anxiety of not being able to see her friends, be on routine, go to school, and so forth. The intent is for the child's behavior to improve not only in the setting where the intervention occurs, but to generalize to other settings. Fortunately, or I guess maybe unfortunately, is my daughter really only talks back at home. We don't see this in the school setting. She doesn't do this with other family members. But if she would be doing this in the school setting, the hope would be is that she would also stop talking back in the school setting as well. And then there's also teacher training. So we see a lot of behaviors out in the school setting. And sometimes, especially if a student's on an IEP, they might need to be trained on how to interact with that student. What are some positive reinforcers? What are some consequences we can still instill in the classroom in order to accomplish our goals together and to have them translate across different settings and generalize across different settings? Well, and how well does this type of therapy work? Well, empirical evidence highly supports behavioral therapies. They work pretty well, especially depending on what type of issue or problem you're having. They have been found effective for a range of disorders and some specific disorders. Some of these specific disorders are going to be OCD, PTSD, panic disorder, and social phobia. And behavior therapies lend themselves to manualization and quantitative outcome measures necessary for empirical testing. So it is easy for us to create a manual regarding behavioral types of therapies, and we're also able to do empirical testing because we should be defining the behavior, getting a baseline, going across the board, seeing how the behavior changes over time. Is our intervention working? Is it not is our intervention not working? So we are able to gather a lot of empirical evidence and data when we are using behavioral types of settings. So that's great. We can either show those therapies work or those techniques don't work. So it is nice for manualization and for quantitative outcome and empirical testing. So that was just a brief overview, pretty quick, about behavioral therapy. If you have any questions, let me know. I am going to create a chapter 14 discussion question thread, or a chapter 14 discussion thread so you can ask questions about chapter 14. So if you have any questions about chapter 14, write them under that thread, and I will either answer them at the end of the week, or I'll either type the response, or I'll do another video depending on how many different questions we have. So if you do have any questions, I will create a new discussion tab just for that, and I'll do that for all the chapters going forward. That way, if you're reading or watching this video and don't understand something, you can put the question there and I will come back and answer all those. So I hope you're all doing well. I miss you a lot. Keep safe out there, self-isolate, and hopefully we will get to go back to civilization and socializing soon. See you later, guys.